Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers Podcast, a proud part of the Wanderbarn Podcast Network.
I'm Ryan.
I'm Amanda.
And we're your hosts.
We're a traveling couple and digital nomads taking you on our adventures as we explore locations, destinations, and careers.
Enjoy the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the World Wanderers Podcast. Today, we are really excited to be chatting with Aubrey Carter from All Ears English.
Aubrey is a certified IELTS instructor for All Ears English and is the co-host of the IELTS Energy podcast. She received her master's degree in the TESOL, the TESOL, from the City College of New York and has been an ESL instructor for 19 years. And we had a fabulous conversation with Aubrey all about her journey learning a second language, which for her is French, how that took her traveling, and how actually learning a language can really help your travels and improve your experience going abroad. We also talk about the work that she does with All Ears English, tips for learning languages, and so much more. So this is a jam-packed episode, and if you like learning languages as much as we do, you're going to love this episode.
Before we dive into the episode, we want to give a reminder about the World Wanderers Insider podcast. This month on the Insider, we're talking to our good friend Madison Canna about how, with self-directed learning, she built a career in web development, and how, if you're interested in building a career that could allow you to travel, you could do the same. So we're diving into that, the different languages you can learn, and how Madison went about getting her first paid opportunities. If that sounds like something that's interesting to you, or if you're looking for other resources that could help you build a career that allows you to travel and work, you can go to patreon.com/theworldwanderers, sign up, and get the World Wanderers Insider into your feed today.
Welcome to the podcast today, Aubrey. We're really excited to have you here with us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's so fun to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really awesome because we got to chat with you for All Ears English a couple of weeks ago, and now we get to flip the script a little bit and have you on the show. So first question for you is, where are you joining us from?
I am in Phoenix, Arizona. So it's I've lived here for 15 years now. I grew up in Idaho in the United States and then moved to Arizona after college for a job, and I haven't left. I actually really love it. It gets very hot in the summer, but other than that, it's a great place to live.
Amazing. Sounds very nice. I'm always jealous of people who grew up in warm places or who live in warm places all year round.
I know I had plenty of snow and cold in Idaho, when I was younger, so I knew I was done with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that.
Yeah, we can definitely both relate to that. And so we want to dive in and talk a lot about language learning today. But to start off with, how did you kind of get started traveling, and what kind of clicked with travel to make it a passion of yours?
Yeah, the first place I ever traveled was to France as an exchange student when I was 16, and I loved it. It was an amazing experience. I was in southern France, near Toulon, and I loved it. And so then when I went to university, I actually chose my major I chose a degree that required you to travel. It was called European Studies, and you had to do some type of study abroad or field study in another country and choose a language spoken there. So I was really excited about that. I went as an au pair and I did a field study. I took several correspondence courses through the university, and I was in Europe for a year. I was an au pair in Belgium, and then I got a train pass and just traveled all over Western Europe and absolutely fell in love with travel. I stayed in hostels, and I did not have a lot of money, so sometimes I would just sleep on a train in between cities in the middle of the night, really, really going on the cheap. But I loved it, and I fell in love with travel.
Yeah, I think we can both definitely relate to, doing whatever you can to just be able to travel. And sometimes that means you just take, the cheapest accommodation and the cheapest transportation you can, and you make it work, right? So that you can have that experience.
Yeah, exactly. That's how it was for me. I knew I couldn't afford to go lavishly. I was still very young, I was backpacking around, but I loved it. There was never a time where I was like, oh, I wish I had more money. Actually, that's not true. There were a few times where I would have gone to a museum that was quite expensive, but I just couldn't afford it. So I did miss some things like that. I'll have to go back someday to some of the cities where I wasn't able to go to everything because entry fees were too high.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can both relate to that from our backpacking days.
Yeah.
And so at that time when you were backpacking around, were you also like interested in languages, or was that something that kind of came later?
Yeah, I had taken French in high school and college, but then I was shocked when I got there and I really expected to be able to be communicating. I had taken so many classes and I couldn't understand a word. And I was really hesitant, especially with groups. I had a hard time joining a group if people were talking and very fast and I couldn't follow it. So I started getting much more serious about really learning the language to be able to communicate. And so, and then I did pretty fast. And I know you guys have had the same experience where when you're immersed in a language in a country, it comes so much faster because you're forced to speak with people and you have the opportunity to speak with people all the time. And I learned so much. I learned more in 2 months living in Belgium than I had in 10 years of taking French classes.
We went to Spain in 2011. And I mean, this is so silly of us to think that we would be able to speak any Spanish at this point. We had both taken Spanish at our respective high schools. And I mean, when you live in Western Canada and you're in high school, like your Spanish classes aren't that quality. Like I think both of our classes were taught by, second language speakers.
Right.
And we never used it in the towns that we grew up in. Both of us are from small towns in Western Canada. And then to just think that like, oh, it's been a bunch of years since I learned this, but I did learn some in school, we'll be totally fine. I just remember being like, oh my gosh, I understand nothing. I don't really know how to say anything other than like my name is, bathroom. And I would just look on menus, and if I saw something that said pollo, which is the word for chicken, I would just choose to eat that because I knew that I like chicken. I like food with chicken in it. Like I literally didn't understand anything. It was so eye-opening.
Well, it's so the textbook way of teaching, right? Kind of the older way of learning a language where you're in a class, you're learning from a textbook. You often can write fairly well, and your grammar is pretty good, but you don't have enough opportunities to speak or to listen or to have general native like conversations. And so if you've had several classes, you can travel to a country thinking, I'm going to be able to understand. And that textbook learning just doesn't prepare you.
Yeah, not at all. Especially like I find it probably is a bit better in university, but in those high school classes where everyone like wants to look cool and no one pronounces anything even close to being right, and then you start hearing people and you're like, I don't know what any of the sounds anyone's making even mean.
Yeah, well, at least my experience at university was the same. My university French classes were very similar to my high school French classes. And I did have a native French teacher, but it was still, I mean, this is 20 years ago. It's improving some now, but she still was teaching from a textbook and we'd listen, and maybe turn and talk to our partner a little bit, but more writing, not a lot of chances to really have regular conversations and have those chances to communicate. We were much more concerned about having perfect grammar.
Yeah. And then, so through college, were you thinking you wanted to work in language learning as a career?
Yeah, I was. I wasn't sure exactly if I was going to try and teach French or because I also really loved ELA. I loved English. And that's what I did end up doing my master's in was TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. But I ended up teaching French actually because I was living in the Bronx, teaching high school in the Bronx, and their language teacher quit last minute and they just didn't have anyone. So they said, does anyone else speak a second language they could maybe teach? And I spoke French, so I ended up teaching French and really loved it. So I've taught the high school level, both French and English.
Oh, awesome. That's amazing. And that came after you did your work in France?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I came back, I did my master's degree. I actually did the New York City Teaching Fellows program, which is a lot like Teach for America, if you've heard of Teach for America. I did it in New York City, and it's a really great program. Basically, they pay for your master's degree, so your degree is free in exchange for you teaching in a high needs school, like a difficult school in an inner city. And they with the master's degree, you're also sort of trained in their way of thinking, which is just that everyone can succeed. Everyone can learn and succeed at the same level, regardless of socioeconomic background. Whereas, at least in the United States, a lot of teachers sort of come up through the secondary education system, potentially not believing that, sort of but buying into that a person's privilege can make them a better student. And so the Teach for America and the Teaching Fellows program is sort of trying to break that mold.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things I'm curious about is just sort of your experience going back to France and around travel and learning languages. You said that, you didn't speak much French when you got there and you kind of had to change the way that you were actually like learning and engaging. What did you do to actually be able to like flip everything and actually be able to learn and speak French?
Yeah, so I just threw out the textbook. I stopped trying to learn grammar and I started focusing a lot more on trying to make connections with people and trying to just have conversations, read books, watch TV, there weren't really podcasts at the time, but listen to the radio in French and really try to immerse myself in listening and speaking instead of trying to write and focus on grammar. And then it just started to click. I started to be able to understand and speak in conversations. And I think that basis a little bit I had gotten in classes helped some, for sure. I had kind of some foundation, but it just propelled me to be able to understand and communicate very fast.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think that is similar to our experience too, like going from learning via a textbook and, even trying apps like Duolingo. And I kind of dabbled with Rosetta Stone with Spanish and just was really struggling to be able to actually have conversations. And when we moved to Mexico a couple years ago, I just, I hired a language teacher to just talk to me. Like I was like, I don't want you to teach me any verb conjugations. Like I know how to conjugate verbs in Spanish. The problem is that I can't use them because somebody said something to me and I'm like so like, oh my God, what did they just say to me that I can't even use these things that are in my brain? And I think that was like one of the biggest turning points for me with Spanish for sure.
Yeah, exactly. With the podcast I work at, where I interviewed you guys, All Ears English, that's sort of our motto is connection, not perfection. That if all you're doing is focusing on grammar and the textbook, you just don't have those natural native connections where you actually start loving the language and learning the language. And if it's tedious and boring, it's so hard to spend a lot of time at it, right? You actually will spend the time to improve your language skills and start, going out and meeting people and being less shy and more confident about just starting up a conversation with some natives.
Yeah, and just as kind of hear you say that, I think as well about just how kind of natural it is for us as humans to pick up language. Like if you move from, the West Coast to New York, and then you come back like a year later, all your friends are going to be like, oh, you sound like you're from New York now,
Right.
And I think it's the same thing with other languages too. As long as you can kind of understand a little bit of what's going on, you just pick it up naturally.
Exactly, right? And we have so many resources at our disposal now. We don't have to go to the country necessary to learn or in preparation of going to a country. There's so much we can do. There are so many podcasts. And I actually love Duolingo's podcast where it's like half Spanish and a little bit English to make sure you're following along. And, podcasts like that where it is just native, natural speech that you're starting to understand. And then also some that encourage you to speak as well. So we do have resources like that can immerse us some before we're actually in a place where we can talk to people who speak that language.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I know for us as well, and it's a little bit more of like an intermediate level stuff, but Netflix has been so amazing over the past handful of years as they've added more and more shows and so many podcasts out there as well, like All Ears English, and others to learn the language. And so something I'm curious about, and something we actually talked about a bit when we were on your guys' show, was this idea of like how language learning can add more when you travel. I think there's a lot of people who maybe feel a little bit down on their ability to learn languages, especially from those traditional educational experiences. What would you say to people who have maybe like over the past little while been traveling and not really invested much in learning languages about why they maybe should try a bit more when it comes to language while traveling?
Yes, I have definitely seen the two opposite ends of the spectrum. When I was in Scandinavia and a lot of the places I went to in Europe, I didn't speak the language at all. And there's a chance that I would have been able to find people who spoke English, but I didn't even try because I didn't want to assume they spoke English. And I hadn't even I didn't have a smartphone back then, and I hadn't done anything to even find out how to say, hello, how are you in that language. And I didn't want the first thing I said to someone to be English. So I just kept to myself and I kind of wandered the city. And I regret that so much. I wish so much that I could go back and find one person and, at least if I didn't have a smartphone, I didn't have access to find out how to say those things. Ask them, how do I say hello, how are you? Ask them to teach me a few phrases. I know that I wouldn't have had to talk to very many people before I'd find someone who didn't mind that I was asking in English and would be happy to teach me a few introductory phrases. And it's even easier for us now because before you go to a country, you do have access to all of these language learning apps and all of these resources where you can learn some of those basic phrases, where you can at least have a little bit of the basics in a language. Like you guys were talking when you came on All Ears English, it's such a good tip to just learn some of the basics so that the first thing you say to someone can be in their own language. And then you can make some connections with people wherever you go.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with that. I think that it's really amazing, especially in a country where a lot of people don't necessarily try to speak the language, to be able to say something, in that language and then see, the face of that person light up. And an example that comes to mind for me is Ryan actually worked in a kitchen, like just cooking and doing chef stuff with a guy who's Czech and a girl who's Japanese. And so when we went to Japan a couple years ago, he knew like a couple of Japanese phrases, and so he would like order something in Japanese and they would just be so excited that he spoke like 5 words of Japanese to them. They just loved it.
Yes, I've had the same experience in Paris where people say, "Oh, Parisians are so unkind and so cold." But if the first thing you say to them is in French and you're really trying, I have never had that experience. Everyone has always been so happy to speak with me, so kind, so welcoming. But yeah, if the first thing you say to them is in English, I don't blame them for being cold. Why would you go to their country and expect them to speak your language? It's just impolite.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, what are some of your top tips for people who want to learn a language based on some of the things that you've seen through the work that you do and then your own personal experiences?
Yeah, so there are some really specific things. Like, for example, right now at All Ears English, we're doing a series on phrasal verbs. And I have found that in English, if you try to just learn a list of verbs and all the phrasal verbs associated, like take check, for example, check in, check out, check on, check up, they all have such different meanings that it's really difficult to keep track of them. And then you're never able to actually use them in a regular conversation. So instead, if you pick a conversation where you're going to actually hear them and use them, like for example, travel, and you think of all the phrasal verbs you'll use when going to the airport and checking in, right? Pick up somebody on the way, check in once you get there, then the plane will take off. Like the phrasal verbs that are actually different verbs, but are more related because you're using them in a similar situation. So tips like that are so helpful when you start thinking about how your brain actually works. Like, what situation am I going to use this vocabulary in? Learn it in context so that it's there and available and your mind can access it instead of lists of vocabulary words, which are never going to be helpful.
And do you think that for people who are like starting right as beginners, that also applies? Like instead of thinking, hey, I need to start memorizing like a bunch of words, just if you're traveling to pick a situation and then start learning things for those specific situations?
Yes, definitely, right? If you have lists and lists of vocabulary in a notebook somewhere, even if you're trying to learn them in context and in like example sentences, it's just so hard for your brain to then take that and pull it into the situation you're in. But if you, like a lot of podcasts will do this, we're like, today we're talking about travel vocabulary. Let's talk about some of the phrases we would use. Then your brain hears it all in context and you're able to actually use it when you're in that situation. So even for beginners, think about topics, right? Think about what you will be talking about. Brainstorm the phrasal verbs you'll use, the vocabulary you will use, idioms that would work in that situation, and learn them in context. Visualize yourself in that situation. Practice speaking out loud, imagining yourself in that situation. And then when you're in that situation, that vocabulary will come to you.
Yeah, I really like that tip. And I think just thinking about my own experience learning languages, I think that that's something that's really helpful. Like, I think we kind of get caught up in this idea of like, oh, I need to understand like the translation of, can I have? And sometimes those things don't directly translate. And most of the time they actually don't just directly translate. I feel like it's almost better to like train your brain just to learn the sounds of another language to ask this similar thing without getting stuck on like how to directly translate it, if that makes sense.
Yes, exactly, right? Otherwise, you'll end up sounding like Google Translate, where you're just doing everything directly, though that is getting better. Google Translate's getting better and better, but there's still a lot of things that just don't translate to how natives would say it. So when you're able to listen to native podcasts and learn how natives say things and anticipate how you will hear things, then yeah, you'll be ready. You'll be ready to understand and join conversations and make those connections.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting. Ryan and I both have Spanish language teachers that we do conversational practice with. And there's sometimes where I won't know how to say something. So I'll use like the words that I have in my Spanish vocabulary to formulate a sentence. And my language teacher, because he's a language teacher, he understands. And he'll be like, that's not really like how we say that though. Like that's very very, very gringo, what you just said. He's like, let me teach you how like a local says that, like an actual person who's like speaks Mexican Spanish.
Yes,
And then
which is
I'm
what
like,
we
oh,
want,
okay.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I feel like there's a couple things that have been, I feel like that and letting go of translations has been really helpful, like direct translations. And then the
Yeah.
other thing that I think has been good for us has been pronunciation, because like Ryan mentioned, we, didn't use like Spanish pronunciation when we were in high school. We just learned kind of how to say it with English accents. And it's really hard because you like work up the courage to ask for something in another language. But then if you've got this really hard to understand accent, then sometimes people don't know what you're actually trying to say, which can be discouraging.
Yes, and along with pronunciation, intonation, which is different in every language. And a lot of students who are learning English don't think about the intonation. Like maybe at the end of what they say, they're always going up, where a native would actually go down. And then just how much we emphasize different words, like, adjectives. We'll say, I was really into that. Whereas a native might have more of a flat tone because the intonation is not the same in their native language. And they would just say, I was really into that, And so to think about intonation in the language you're learning and talk to natives, how would your intonation and pronunciation be when you're talking? And then just to listen to native podcasts, because then we hear the intonation and pronunciation and we know how it works. In fact, one of the podcasts we have is called IELTS Energy, and it prepares students who are taking this IELTS exam. And part of their speaking exam, they're actually also graded on their pronunciation and intonation. And if they just have a kind of a flat monotone intonation, even if their pronunciation is perfect, they still will get a low score because it doesn't sound like a native.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's something that because we've spent a lot of time traveling in Latin America, have realized as well with a language like Spanish, which is really awesome because if you learn Spanish, it gives you like a big foot up in so many different places and parts of the world. However, it's like from region to region, it is very different. And so we like define it as like, oh, this is Spanish and that's Spanish and this is Spanish. But if you talk to someone who's Panamanian, someone who's Mexican, someone who's Argentinian, and someone who's from Spain, like it's going to be really, really different and like really hard to adapt.
Exactly, right? The dialects are so different, and the intonation, the pronunciation, and slang, right? There'll be a lot of vocabulary you wouldn't even understand.
Yeah, 100%. When we moved to Panama last year before the pandemic started, we were like learning all of the Panamanian slang. And they have a lot because of the influence with the canal and the canal zone and stuff like that. There's a lot of like American influence and then a lot of Caribbean influence. So they have a lot of really interesting words that come from, English, like or plays on English and stuff like that. So we were learning all of their slang, and we previously kind of knew more of like the Mexican slang. And then it was funny during the pandemic while we were home, we were watching some shows that are out of Spain. And so it's Spain Spanish. So not only adjusting to different use of verbs, different accent, but also they use, different slang. So you're kind of learning these different ways that people talk, it's really interesting. Once you dive into it, it's really fascinating.
Yes, right. And the more we don't even think about how we do that in English, but the more I'm teaching English through All Ears English, you realize how many idioms we have and how much slang we have that that's the same in every language. Every language has so much idiomatic language and slang. It can be very daunting to learn all of that. But so my advice for anyone out there who's trying to learn a language is to give yourself grace, right? To not be expecting don't expect to be perfect. Don't expect to know it all. Just try to connect with people. Try to try to have a lot of input that is very native, whether that's podcasts or TV shows or speaking to any natives you can meet. That is how you're going to really love the language. And all of that, the grammar and idioms and all of that will come bit by bit.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me curious about when you're working with your students and people who are learning English, do you kind of recommend that they focus on like one specific area? So like instead of listening to a British podcast and then an Australian TV show and then something from America, do you kind of recommend that people focus in on like one specific area and try to find more and more content from one place before doing a bunch of stuff from different countries?
No, so when we're teaching students who are preparing for the IELTS exam, they will be facing every accent on the listening test because they have Australian accents and British accents that could be from anywhere. So we recommend that they take it in from everywhere, right? Listen to podcasts of all these different languages, watch TV shows because they need to be familiar with all of these accents. It could, depending on what type of language learner you are, depending on how your brain works, if that is very confusing to you, you could spend a week or two on one accent until you feel like you understand it well and then move on to the other one. But you certainly can't be like, I'm just going to learn, British and American and call it good. You really have to expose yourself to all these different accents so that you can understand, not just for the IELTS exam, but also you never know who you're going to meet from where or what, country is going to come out with an amazing TV show that you should definitely see. And you want to be able to understand all those accents.
Yeah, for sure. That 100% makes sense.
And so, Aubrey, I'm curious about kind of your story. We talked a bit about kind of early travels, doing your master's, working in education where you're teaching English and French to English speakers. How did you kind of come to start working in the field you're in now?
So I was teaching college French here in Arizona. We moved from New York City back to Arizona. All our families here, and New York also has a terrible winter. So as much as I loved it there, we were escaping the snow to come back. And I got a job teaching at a community college here, French, which I really loved. But then I found out I was expecting twins. And basically my entire salary would have gone to childcare for these twins. So I decided to stay home and I needed a work from home job. And I was lucky enough to find All Ears English was hiring a podcast co-host. And so I joined their team. There are 4 of us podcast hosts. And then, of course, we also run the social media and we teach web classes and we teach one-on-one classes with our students. So it's definitely expanding. We have language classes for general fluency in English, this IELTS exam, and also business English. So it's been really great to be able to be part of the development of all of that. And, helping also with marketing and creative strategies has been amazing. I've really loved it. And it's an opportunity to work from home, which was more rare before the pandemic. Now a lot of jobs are at home.
Yeah, you were doing it like before it was cool to work from home.
Before you had to.
Yeah, exactly. We were kind of in the same boat, so can definitely relate to that. It's like we were just well practiced for pandemic life.
Exactly. But then it was so difficult because when school went online, I have 4 children. I have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old, and then my twins are now 6. So they were all home doing online school. And I record 3 to 4 podcasts a week. So that can be very difficult when you have 4 noisy kids at home. So I was very, I was trying to help them with their schooling and also still work. So it just creates so many difficulties and challenges for parents that are working, whether outside of the home or from home. And so I know it's everyone's having probably even more extreme struggles than me, but I have some friends who have older kids only home and they'll complain about it. I'm like, you just take 2 6-year-old twins and try to help them with online school while working, and then you can complain to me.
Yeah, no, 100%. I feel like, working from home when you've got childcare for your kids or your kids are able to be in school is like a totally different ballgame than trying to do
Yeah.
your job while also trying to navigate online schooling. And it seems like too, I mean, this was all new to the kids too, and it's not like they know what's going on. So you kind of have to support in that way to get them adjusted to their routine and stuff like that while trying to do your job, which is basically trying to like do two full-time jobs.
Right, exactly. So my kids at least are in school in person again. So it's helpful for me to be able to work, but it's also kind of scary because I mean, there's just a chance they could be home again doing online school any day. There are no COVID cases here right now, but if there were, then they would just have school again at home. So it's just kind of going day by day, seeing what happens.
Yeah. And so I'm curious what the transition's like from working with English speakers learning a second language to working with second language speakers learning English. Is that something you find like more, like, is there anything that you find like more fulfilling about that or different about it?
I really am loving what I'm doing now because I am more on the IELTS exam preparation side of it. And these students are so motivated. They're students from all over the world who are looking to immigrate to usually Canada, UK, or New Zealand because the scores they have to get for this exam are much higher for those countries. And often their family is already there. And the only thing holding them back from getting there is their scores to this exam. So it's very different from teaching high school or even college students who are, maybe just doing a prerequisite or like a language requirement, or maybe they're excited to learn it, but they didn't have this kind of motivation. And a lot of our students have been offered a job. A lot of them are doctors or scientists that have been offered a job in an English speaking country, but they can't take it until they pass this exam, which is a very difficult exam. It's expecting very high level language proficiency. And so sometimes they'll take it over and over and over and can't get the scores they need. So it's very fulfilling to me to be able to help them get the scores they need on this exam. I work with an ex-examiner. She was an examiner for this exam for 14 years. So she knows all the ins and outs and all the strategies. We can get them all the information they need so they can finally pass this test and move on with their life and accomplish their goals. So that is very rewarding for me.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can imagine that probably feels like pretty good to like help somebody be able to pass that exam and then be able to see them like go on to reunite with their family or be able to immigrate where they want to go. And just like the feeling of accomplishment with that must be like pretty awesome.
Yes, right. I know it's very rewarding, which is nice because I have had jobs, especially when I was teaching in the Bronx at the high school where I was teaching. I loved my students and I did find it rewarding, but it was also very challenging because a lot of them did not want to be there. There was a lot of work motivating them, and sometimes that's good. I like a good challenge, but when all of your efforts can just be put toward helping students accomplish their goals instead of trying to help convince them of why they should make goals and want goals in the first place, it is so much more fulfilling, and you're able to focus so much more on, what really needs to be happening, and then see people progress and move on so much faster. And it's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've talked a little bit throughout the episode around, kind of like resources to getting started to learn a language. I know you mentioned podcasts and stuff like that. What other resources do you generally recommend to people who are wanting to learn, a second language?
So the main thing is I would just avoid textbooks. I think textbooks are just the wrong way to go. I think anything you are doing to try and give yourself opportunities to have connections with either natives or other people learning that same language is going to be your best bet. It's going to be your best opportunity to create those connections with people, to motivate yourself and realize I can actually use this language. This is exciting, and you'll be more engaged, more motivated. So I know you recommended Rosetta Stone and Duolingo. Those are great for learning the basics. Like you do need to know grammar. You need to know a lot of these phrasal structures. And I think there are a lot of apps that teach that in a more engaging way than a textbook, right? Or an in-person class. I don't recommend an in-person class. I even took one I know sometimes it can be really good to go to a country and sign up for an in-person class. And that's a great way to meet other people to be chatting with. And maybe it will be a more interactive, engaging class. But I took one in France and it was the same as my classes in the United States, or it was just a textbook and writing. And so you kind of never know what you're going to get with an in-person class. But if you're trying to learn on your own, I just immerse yourself in the language. Read the newspaper in that language. Read a novel in that language. Listen to podcasts, watch TV shows, listen to music in that language, and then go to like a meetup for people. And now meetups are more online than in person, but find a language meetup in your area and chat with other people. So natives will come as well as people learning the language. And there are Facebook groups where you can do that as well to force yourself. I have one more good suggestion, which I actually got from the Fluent Show hosts. And I loved this suggestion, was to sign up for online classes, something you're interested in that language. And so this is definitely not beginner, like definitely intermediate or higher, but it forces you weekly to go to this class, listen to the lecture or whatever is happening, interact with the other students, and then you are responsible. You can't just say, oh, I'll just do it next week. You've paid the money to take this class, and that's a great motivation to actually do it. And then you have a chance to meet other people that also speak that language.
Yeah, those are all amazing suggestions. And I feel like, those are things that we've done, all of those between us. And I think that has really helped us like propel our Spanish forwards. And I think to like, I don't know, I didn't really love Rosetta Stone personally. It was just, I felt like it was kind of expensive for what I got out of it. But Duolingo, I feel like is a really good place to start if you don't really know anything about the language. And then the Duolingo podcast, which you mentioned, I'm not sure if they have anything other than the Spanish one. Do you know?
They have French and Spanish. And I think they're working on more languages. I'm not sure if they've come out with more, but yeah, that's a great one too.
Yeah, for sure. I felt like it was helpful for me because they interview people from all over the place. So you can hear, a local speak from Mexico. You can hear a local speak from Guatemala. You can hear people speak from Colombia, Argentina, which means you get a little bit like we were talking about those differences in accents. But then it's cool because, like you mentioned, they sprinkle in English so that, because one of the things I found like as I was learning more Spanish is your brain gets tired really fast. So you kind of have to build up your stamina a little bit, like almost like you're training for a marathon. Like it becomes hard at first to think in that language for longer than maybe like 1 or 2 minutes. Right. And it's cool because that podcast does like switching back and forth and it kind of gives your brain a break. It's nice when you're like, okay, cool, I'm actually getting what this is saying. And then it goes back into the language. And then you can build up from there. We watch a lot of stuff on Netflix, like Ryan said, listen to podcasts and audiobooks and stuff in Spanish now. And it becomes easier and easier the more you do it.
Yeah, for sure.
It just becomes like more normal. You can think a little bit less and just enjoy a little bit more.
Right. I also love News in Slow Spanish. Have you listened to that app? I'm like, oh, this is nice. They slow it down a little bit so I can actually get the news and also in Spanish, but a little slower. Because if I try to watch the news in Spanish, it's very difficult for me to understand. So I love that app, News in Slow Spanish.
Yeah, I've listened to that a couple of times, and definitely with watching the news, you'd end up talking like really weird too. Like if you learned like from the English news, people, hello, I am very interested in what is going on with you.
Like, oh, you sound like a newscaster, right?
Yeah, and so can you tell us? I know you mentioned it a few times, but can you tell us a bit more about All Ears English?
Yeah, for sure. So you can get more information on our website, allearsenglish.com. And then if you are trying to learn English, we have courses for anything you're trying to focus on, right? Just general fluency. It's a really interesting course where our CEO, Lindsay, and one of our other podcasters, Jessica, they did like across the United States and down around road trip through the Rust Belt, through the Deep South to the Northwest. And they interviewed natives from all over the United States. So they got the accents all over, and they interviewed them about really interesting subjects, right? Like gun control and racism in America, police brutality. And so you learn a lot about issues that are important to Americans while hearing all these other accents. So that's a really great course. And then our IELTS Energy, our prep course for the IELTS exam, and then our business English course. So if you work in English, but English isn't your first language, a lot of your options, a lot of the business courses online are very outdated. And this one, it's brand new, and we've really tried to think about the new and changing economy. We interviewed over 100 native business people, and we have interviews on there with natives and just information directly from them of what actually is happening in the business world today, the vocabulary you need to know, skills and strategies to make those connections at work so that you don't miss out on promotions just because English isn't your first language. So definitely check out those courses. And yeah, we have 2 podcasts, All Ears English and IELTS Energy, that you could also subscribe to on wherever you find your podcasts.
Awesome. Yeah. And I know just from looking at our geographic map of the world wanders, sometimes there's people all over the place listening. So hopefully some English learners will be able to take advantage of that. And it's a really interesting point about the business English. It's something I actually hadn't thought about. But yeah, over the past 10 years with like tech and startups and stuff, the language is like completely different for an English speaker. And if you were taking like a business English course in a university, they're probably teaching you about like faxes and like memos and stuff.
Right. And they may be updating a little bit, but it's still learning from a textbook, right? Which it just is not the ideal way. It's not the most engaging. It's not what's really going to propel you fast to be able to have a conversation, over coffee at work or at the water cooler.
Yeah, absolutely. This conversation has been amazing, Aubrey. We really appreciate your time and all of your insights around language learning. We're definitely very aligned in terms of like how to learn a language and that sort of thing, which is always amazing to hear. If people want to learn more about you specifically or follow you, where can they go to find that?
I guess you could look me up on Facebook, Aubrey Carter. I don't have that much of a presence on social media. Other than that, I moderate in for each of our courses, we have a private Facebook group, which is a really supportive community, which is awesome. And so I'm in there all the time. So I don't have time to do anything else on social media, but they could also email me, aubrey@allearsenglish.com, if you have any questions for me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this, for your time and for this interview.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. This was really fun. And thanks for being on All Ears English. Your podcast was amazing. I loved it. Our students loved it. Our listeners loved it. So yeah, thanks again.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you want more, make sure to check out The World Wanders Insider, available on Patreon at patreon.com/theworldwanderers.
For show notes, head over to theworldwanderers.com. Find us on social media at The World Wanderers Podcast and join the private Facebook community at World Wanderers, a community for travelers.
You can always get in touch with us at info@theworldwanderers.com. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps us find new listeners.
See you next time.